and who have done the refurbishing of the dock, ready for releasing and future uses. And we have Rich Graham, who is the future, is a lessee for the dock, and we hope to hear a little bit, maybe, of if there's any hint of the plans that Schmidbauer might have for this dock. So I think I'd like to start with celebrating this 50th world-breaking did Tracy Craig, I think you were going to be first up, or what? Okay, Gayle will be the first speaker. And also there are plenty of these, I printed out a bunch of copies of the list of all that we have done. And as far as that goes, we do have, I didn't put the website on here, but we have HumboldtWorkingPort.org, and it's a place that you can go and you can see a lot of these. Sorry, what? Oh, and we have this absolutely gorgeous 50th anniversary cake that we're going to share with you. It's really beautiful. It's on the free store. So, welcome Gayle and Joel. I believe that I believe that your father is the one who is the founder of this dock. So we'll look forward to hearing about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, congratulations on your 50th anniversary. I left here 50 years ago, and most of my knowledge about the dock is from 50 years ago, but hopefully other people can help out. But both Trace and myself will talk a little bit about the history of the dock, but the facility itself is owned by Eureka Forest Products. My family acquired the property in 1968. It's located at the west end of 14th Street. It's approximately 16 acres and a tidelands lease of about 5 1/3 acres adjacent. There's a public weighing station on the property. There's new shops, about 14,000 square feet of shops, an older office building, and most importantly, the dock itself, which is 33,000 square feet. The depth channel next to the dock is about 38 to 40 feet, and the nearby channel 35 to 41. A portion of the property was used for electrical steam generation and then gas manufacturing for heat from 1902 until 1954. And that is how we get into this relation with PG&E, because PG&E bought the property, I think around 1927, and there was resulting contaminant in the soil, bunker oil primarily, that led to the last 20 years of work with PG&E to clean the property. From about 1876 forward, there were sawmills on the property. Luckily for us, none of the contamination was linked to the timber companies. It all fell back on PG&E. My brother Joel, who's here, is the president of Eureka Forest Products, following my father Victor. And when I was in high school and still living here, the primary use of the dock was exporting logs to Japan. And these huge ships would come in about every 6 weeks, and they would take 6 million board feet of logs, not timber or chips. And this went on for almost a decade. And then when the need dwindled in Japan, there was some shift to China for a few years. And then after that, it was more domestic operation. And in 1993, released the dock, the exclusive use of the dock, to Sierra Pacific. And they've operated primarily a chip operation on the property until a few months ago. Now, as Rich will explain, excuse me, Schmidbauer Lumber Company is now leasing the property, and after Tracy's presentation, he'll talk about what they envision for the property as well as some of their other operations. When my father purchased a property, I remember him telling us about a 50-year lease, which I thought was preposterous because when you're a teenager or younger, the idea of 50 years just seems silly. But anyway, that expired about 6 months ago, and Lisa Savage, who's here from the city, helped us renegotiate a new Tidelands lease. They didn't give us 50 years, they gave us close to that. So the use of the dock with the Tidelands lease remains in place. So I'm going to turn it over to Tracy, and she'll tell you about their activities.
Hi there, I'm Tracy Craig, and I'm here on behalf of PH&E, and you're going to have to bear with me while I do a little... Okay, hang on a minute, we have it ready to go. So, I got here this morning, I drove from the Bay Area, got up at 5 o'clock, drove up here. I'll talk while this is going on. Thank you for the lunch, it was awesome. Thank you for the cake, I think it's for us because we came, but thank you, it's very nice. So do I have my...
Larry,
hey, little help here. Did you have this all tuned up and ready to go? All right, so as soon as my presentation comes up, the lens open on the top. Okay, I did open the lens. It just takes a minute to heat up. So as Gayle had talked about, a manufactured gas plant operated on the site that they have, which is over, I believe, this way. And I don't know who knows what manufactured gas plants are, but they were kind of a big deal back in the day. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s, they would put, if you got a manufactured gas plant in your town, you would bomb, right? You would be able to have gas for lighting, cooking, heating, and who's heard of the term the gas lamp district? Anybody been to San Diego? So that's exactly what they would do. They would pump this gas out, light streets, and so it took a lot of the living inside with candles or whatever they used out into the streets, and it greatly increased public safety. So I think the US EPA found something like 4,500 gas plants peppered across the United States, because if a small town had one, you had a viable way of providing electricity for people or for gas for people, and it was a big deal. So, great. Okay, hang on, I know what to do here. You're going to hit this little button. I'm going to hit this little button. There we go. Okay. So just so you can see, there's the site, and there is Humboldt Bay, and the Costco, which is where I shopped when I was working on the site, is right around over here. That was probably the people that asked the most questions about our project. Other than the Guynups, they had quite a few too. So this is what a gas plant looked like. They operated, as I said, 1800s to the 1900s. Certainly not going to read this. I know everybody in here can read. They would use coal or oil, or as Gayle said, bunker seed. They would burn it up. It would go into a holder. The holder would float, and they would pump it out into towns, residences, businesses. Great way to provide a source of fuel. And then when natural gas became available, these all closed down. And it was very common at that time, like the 1930s, 1940s. Some of them operated into the 50s. Very common to bury the material on site because what was left over looked like a charcoal briquette, or a lot of times it was coal tar, which looks like molasses. So very common to just, back in the day, no environmental regulations, they would knock everything over, grade it out, pack it down, and packed really well, and they would leave it in place. The site doesn't really present a health risk because the stuff looks like charcoal briquettes or it looks like molasses, so it doesn't really move, it just sits there. It's pretty amazing. You can open up these sites 50 years later and the stuff is still there. It's quite something. So it doesn't leach out into the bay, but it does need to be cleaned up because it's not in keeping with today's environmental regulations. And if anybody, I don't know here who likes science, but the primary chemicals that we're dealing with are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and also volatile organic compounds. So those are the things that volatilize and you can smell. And then also metals and petroleum products. Okay, so the cleanup, and hold on, I'm getting a little hot up here, so. No, I'm fine. So the cleanup took place from June to December, and we excavated an awful lot of soil. So the primary way that we cleaned up the site was we would excavate some soil, and then we also treated it in place. And I don't know if anybody went down there, but the work was done under a huge tent at the time. Did anybody see that big tent? Yeah, it was big, and the reason that we did that was twofold. One was to stop impacts to the public because the stuff really smells like mothballs. It's called a nuisance odor, but it smells pretty strong. So, oh, what did I do? Is it me? Okay, nobody move. Anyway, so we treated it under a tent, and what we did was we excavated some soil and some of the material, and then we also took what it was a big, huge auger, so a huge, big drill, and we put cement in there. We had a batch plant out there, put cement, we would excavate, put cement in there, bind the cement with the soil that was there, and that would keep all these chemicals from leaching into the groundwater. So we treated a lot of materials in place, and the reason we did that is California has a rule now that they don't want a lot of stuff going into landfills because we're filling up a lot of our hazardous waste landfills. And then secondarily, we didn't want to have a lot of trucks on the highways because it's kind of dangerous to be trucking all of this material out on these skinny little windy highways. So it minimized the impacts to the community. As I said, we did do this work under a tent, and I'll show you some pictures after this. Project was pretty expensive. I think I don't really know all the numbers on it, but it was in the millions. We did spend $3 million locally on this project during the time we were here, and that would be materials that we bought, hotels, food, the crew was all here. So it was a pretty substantial injection of money into the local economy. And then we also recycled quite a bit of the material because there was a lot of asphalt and concrete. And rather than just take it to a landfill, which is expensive because they charge you by the pound, we went ahead, and I think I know your way up here, so is that better? So we went ahead and recycled quite a bit of material. And then we also did some reduction in greenhouse gases because we used very low impact California Air Resources Board compliant products when we did truck the material out of here. And as you can imagine, the state cleanup is overseen by quite a few state agencies. In this case, it was overseen by your Regional Water Quality Control Board, which is located in Santa Rosa. The Air District also had a say in it because we had that tent. And if you're operating under a tent, a lot of those fumes can accumulate, so you have to have a way to vent those safely into the environment. In this case, we had granulated activated carbon, so we would send any air in that tent would be treated and dispersed into the air, but that was done under a permit. And then also, of course, the city of Eureka had to issue us permits to construct and use the roadways. This is the fun part, this is pictures. So this is the tent, and I just wanted to give you kind of an idea of scale. So this was when we were actually constructing it, and then this would be one of the canisters for the batch plant for the concrete mixing. And there's the tent in all its beauty when it was up. So you could actually fit probably about 2 big rig trucks in there, nose to nose, when it was operating. And that's what it looked like when we were doing, this is a very clean picture. I picked the cleanest picture for you. I don't want to show you the dirty pictures. This is a very clean picture, but this is what it looked like when we were in there. So we actually had heavy equipment in there. We would be excavating the soil. The blue thing right there is a sorter because there was a lot of, or it has a screen, there was a lot of debris in there from the gas plant itself. Big, huge concrete footings for the holder and other things. So we would sort all that so we could recycle it. So that's what that was doing there. And that's just an excavation picture, and if you can see here, there's a grout slurry mix where they're stabilizing the soil right there. And they purposely dig small holes in there, small excavation areas, because what you can do is you can control it a lot better if you have a smaller excavation than if you have a huge one. And the point of this whole thing is you want to control your digging so you don't have too many fumes. And there's a big rig being loaded. And then this is just, I don't know if you saw these, Gayle and Joel. This is some material that came out of there. There's a lot of concrete in there. So that is actually a huge footing right there. And this is another one. So we actually had to pull those out, bring them outside, measure them, tell the agency what we found, and then they would be hauled off site. And there'd be rebar in those too. And this is just more excavation and when they're putting in a slurry mix to stabilize the soil. And then after the cleanup is done, they do a couple things. So you can't remove all the material because you're always chasing it. So we try to remove the majority of the impacts or contamination. And then we put down a very thick membrane layer. And then on top of that, we put a gravel base so the water will percolate through there and then we'll have a way to channel the water flow. And then we put asphalt on and there's the finished site. And you know, I always look at this because Gayle said this took almost 20 years. This represents a lot of work that I don't think people realize when you have a project with the state of California. It takes time. I mean, you have to start with an investigation. You have to figure out how contaminated is the site. It's an iterative process. You get one report, they say, we want you to check here. You do that, you know this. You do that, they say, we want you to do more. And then you have to have a cleanup plan, and then the cleanup plan needs to be reviewed by the state, and they have to approve it. And then there's a public comment period, and you folks get to comment on it. And then we get, the green light to go. And then we have to do all the engineering drawings and pull all the permits, which is not easy to get permits in the state of California, especially when you're dealing with contamination. So, it doesn't look like much to you, but it looks like a lot to me. It's beautiful to me. So, and then just a couple other things. I think I just wanted to say this was really we did have community protection measures in there. And I started off with communication because I think that PG&E, and certainly I believe that the best way you can arm the public is by giving them information beforehand what you're doing. So the last thing we wanted was somebody to see a big, huge tent up there and say, what are you doing? And we'll say, what are we doing? We're remediating a contaminated site. And people will freak out because they had no information. So I think about 7 years ago, we started letting the city know what was going on. We briefed a lot of our neighbors and such. And so most folks in the area were pretty well versed what was happening. And then we also had air monitoring just to make sure that public health and the environment was protected. And that was both at the perimeter of the fence. And then also we had real-time air monitors. We would have an engineer that's dedicated to always going around, especially when we were doing excavation, and making sure we weren't above the environmental screening levels of the state of California as established to be protected with public health. And then we just controlled dust sort of the way you always do it, water, foam. We had a tent, we did some noise and vibration monitoring, and then we did have a very robust traffic management program where we cleaned and inspected the trucks before they went out. They had to be involved with a third-party inspection by the Highway Patrol just to keep people safe. So I think that's it for me. Yeah, that's it. Yes?
We'd like to welcome comments and questions.
So what's the highest and best use of that property now? Is it still owned by PG&E?
No, it's owned by the Guynup family, and PG&E had purchased the manufactured gas plant site way back when they were, purchasing all of this, trying to get more reach in what they owned. And I think that it was cleaned up back to what it was zoned for, which is commercial use. So it will be continued to be used commercially. And to clean it up to residential would have been millions and millions of dollars more, and it probably really wouldn't have been the wisest way to spend the money.
It was triggered by Water Quality Board action against PG&E as the gross polluter. And
well, we don't say gross polluter. We say responsible party.
Responsible remediator.
Part of the road.
Would you like to come up and
Yeah.
maybe questions for you also?
And part of it is then it has to be a deed restriction that can never be used for residential.
Yeah. So, and that is exactly right. It's still being monitored by the water board. We will have to do ongoing groundwater monitoring for a few years to make sure to confirm that removing this material and stabilizing it in place actually worked and groundwater quality is improving. And then eventually there'll be a land use covenant placed on the property.
But it's only 3 acres of the 20-acre project.
That is true. It is a small area of the larger
But
footprint.
could it hold like a warehouse or be
Oh, yeah.
used for truck parking or something of that nature?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
It could be staging.
It could be any kind of commercial use, yeah, absolutely.
Ask Rich.
Yeah, where is Rich?
Actually, it has to be port dependent to be used there.
Port dependent.
Come on in here.
You're next up anyway.
I'm next up.
But we would like to be able to ask questions if we get too far down the line if what your concerns might be. Any more questions?
Any more questions for me?
Before we go to Rich, what do you see, what do you foresee that you might have done differently, and this is to both of you, during this whole process of cleanup? And is there anything that pops up to the surface that you would have done differently or like to have seen done differently?
Yeah.
Come on up front. Eddie, can I hear you?
Well, I think I had this started when my father was still alive and I inherited just the files. And I remember the first meeting with PG&E, no offense, but their position was that when our family acquired the property, there was no such thing as claimed dirt, so that we weren't entitled to any compensation or even a cleanup action. Then so this goes to why it took so long and why it's complicated. So first it starts out with what are we going to really do, and it was the argument of who's responsible for what, even though we were never a party to the State Water Board action. Then they thought, okay, well, we'll haul it out. But once they looked at how expensive it would be to either haul it out by truck or barge it, then there was no communication for a long period of time. Then, and maybe you can correct me on this, but the next thought was they were going to set up an osmosis plant and clean it that way. But my recollection is that they can't do that to these type of contaminants. So then that took a couple of years to look at what's the next thing. And then I was told that back east they started using this process where they are adding this adhesive to the contaminant so it doesn't sink, and that might work. So then they had to investigate that, and they had to go through CEQA and all the public hearings. So unless we change the politics of PG&E and state law, I don't know that you could do it much faster. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's just what you might like to see done differently. You know, fast is a different issue in this case, because you're dealing with all kinds of regulatory things, and then you're dealing with deep pockets and how the law has morphed into responsibility too over that period of time.
Well, part of it has been the change in law. I mean, one of the problems we had was just a change in project managers over the,
I think you had 4 or 5, didn't you?
when you go through this many years, then you come up with different teams. And one of the PG&E lawyers that we worked with most recently explained to us that there's old-time PG&E that are take no hostages, and then there's a progressive unit of PG&E, and we got bounced back and forth.
Yeah, but you got the right court at the end. I would say the one thing that I just really like to point out that actually I think when we did the cleanup itself, that went exceedingly well, and it was so short. It was less than a year, right? It was all of the stuff that goes up to it that you wish somehow you could fast track. And I don't think, I do think that PG&E, they started a voluntary cleanup program, partly because they had sites like this and they didn't know what to do with them, and it's going faster now. But I would personally like to see our regulations let us move through these sites, the state regulations, faster, so we don't have these 15-year cleanups. People just don't get it, and then at the end, you have a 9-month project for what was basically 15 years of study. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But the cleanup went well. We did not get any complaints, which is good. Your weather was very helpful too.
We have a question right here and then back there.
You know, I think a lot of times these cleanups take so long because each and every contaminant, I've done a fair amount of
That's what you said,
remediation
yeah.
in my career, but each and every one of these sites is like an entirely new problem. And so the thing you did last time may not work. It's not like building an apartment building where you pour a slab and you put some frames, you put a roof, you sheet it in, and you know, it's like, okay, here's our problem, here's our soil types, here's the water that's near it, how are we gonna do this, you know? And so, a lot of times, you go through 3 or 4 engineering attempts on paper before you get to a shovel in the ground, and it's really, as frustrating as it can be, that's better. You don't want to get halfway through a remediation and go, we're actually causing more damage than we're remediating. That's a nightmare when that happens, let me tell you.
But I think part of the delays had to do with initially, the state water board was really aggressive, but nobody was at risk. The water was tested, it wasn't going into the bay. And so we'd always were just noticed whenever PG&E got a communication, but after the first flurry of letters, you might go 3 years and not have one contact from the state because of all the priority projects in the state. This was super low priority.
We have the next question back here.
Just to clarify, I know you mentioned it earlier, I couldn't hear, so over the 15-year span, how much money was spent on the whole process?
Oh, wow, I think that number is actually confidential, but it was in the millions, definitely, yeah. Yeah, that's not a good answer, that's the answer I'm gonna give you today. And you're a friendly crowd, so thank you.
You can run for office, you can run for office.
Next question right here, and then we'll go on to the next speaker.
You said that the earlier lease was 50 years, and now it's how many years?
You know, the earlier lease was.
The lease?
The Tidelands lease.
Okay, from the
For the Tidelands with the city of Eureka. And now, I think it's 10 plus 30 or 15 plus 30 in auction, so it's still long-term, but not quite 50.
And the land itself is owned by the Guynup family?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Okay, now we'll have our next speaker, Mary.
Yes, well, please, attach to the podium. Rich Graham, he's with Schmidbauer Lumber.
And I've been told to make this last as long as I can.
What time is dinner served?
Dinner?
Dinner served.
You know, I was sad to see Sierra Pacific leave the area, you know, and the property is just too valuable for us to not have access to it. We're just trying to lease the buildings out. In the end, we're hoping we can get large traffic to Southern California and to Hawaii. It's going to be a daunting project. You know, when I started in the business many years ago, there were probably 20 sawmills in Humboldt County. There were 2 pulp mills operating. There were 2 export facilities operating. And I'm pretty sure we have just as many trees now or more than we had back then. So that's food for thought. Schmidbauer Lumber started operation early in 1972. So we're in it for the long haul. Recently, we just completed a new sawmill in the old California Green Diamond facility in Corbell. That sawmill is now up and operating. And we also own a sawmill in Weaverville, California. All of those byproducts, mainly chips, need to come to Eureka. California Redwood is currently running an export facility across the bay. That's our only option. I can't just live with one option for my chips, so that's in essence why we required release on the dock.
So the conveyor belt is still fully functional.
Correct.
It'll be used for loading, but it won't be loading ships, it'll be loading barges
Yeah, I don't believe it can load a ship. It'll have to be barges.
because of,
Draft in that area, and I don't think the boom extends far enough, and it costs a lot of money to move a ship.
because didn't Gail just say that it was something like 38 feet right there?
It's for a ship, but you have to move the ship. Go. And when they load a ship, they really want to compact the chips, so they spray them under tremendous pressure, so they can get as many chips on the ship as they can.
So it condenses.
They don't do that in the bars.
Ah. And our barge is easier than Tim Patricia is here. He can tell us a little bit about whether the barges are easier to get in and out of the.
I think they're probably a little harder since they come in with a tug.
They're harder.
You know, through the years, we brought in approximately 200 barges of logs out of Washington. That a small company called Sierra Pacific put a sawmill in where we were getting those logs from, so that came to an end.
Yeah. More questions?
How do the different mills specialize that you identified 3 mills?
We just mainly produce construction material, framing material, forming material for California markets. Primary markets for us are the Bay Area and Los Angeles. Believe it or not, my primary market is Los Angeles.
Very few trees there.
What's the market? The market is chips of the logs.
Lumber.
Timber.
Lumber.
Finished lumber.
Finished lumber.
And well, you don't have the rail here, so you must ship it down.
We truck it all. If I need to go to the East Coast, I will take it to Reading and put it on a reload.
Does barging ever enter into your shipping formula?
Yes, but the concept of scale is daunting. They would need to do 2 barges a month, and each barge will hold 12 million board feet of lumber, and that's putting too much in one basket. They do make smaller barges. The ones that go to Hawaii would be smaller, and they would hold about 6 million board feet, which is about what one of our sawmills produces in a month.
And that's what you intend to be trying to do?
That's the intent. Mainly it's for having an option to get rid of chips. There's 3 or 4 pulp mills on the West Coast that still have chips barges.
Take it to ship it over to Hawaii. Where do you ship it out of?
It would come right out of the Guynup dock, or Eureka Forest Products.
Do you know if that counts as a barge is the same as shipping as far as how the Army Corps and other people keep track of how much is passing?
I do not know that.
It doesn't count?
Not deep draft.
Not, because it's not deep.
Do you have trouble finding dock space in Los Angeles or Long Beach to offload on?
No, there's plenty of space down there. The problem being the end customer is not on the dock, so it's got to be taken down there, put on a truck. And every time you even look at a piece of lumber, it costs